My brother laughed when I was written out of Dad's will. 6 months later, the lawyer called another family meeting. My brother laughed in my face at our father's own funeral reception when I asked about the will, standing there with a beer in his hand like the question itself was almost funny to him, and it took me exactly 6 months to find out that laugh was going to cost him a great deal more than his pride. I want to say up front that I wasn't some perfect daughter wronged by a cruel family. I hadn't spoken to my father in almost 4 years before he died, and there's a version of this story where a lot of that silence is on me. I'll let you be the judge of how much once you hear the whole thing. My name's Sarah. I'm 34. I manage a physical therapy clinic outside of Columbus, and until about 10 months ago, I would have told you my family was complicated but functional, the way every family describes itself right up until the day it isn't. My father, Robert, spent almost 3 decades building an auto parts distribution business from a single leased warehouse into something with 2 locations, 18 employees, and by the time he turned 60, an operation worth somewhere north of $2 million once you counted the inventory, the property, and the delivery fleet. My older brother Mike started working there the summer he turned 18 and never left. I went a different direction entirely, nursing school first, then a pivot into practice management once I realized bedside care wasn't sustainable for me long term, and Mike made it clear in the particular way older brothers do without ever quite saying it outright that the business was his path and I'd chosen mine and the two weren't supposed to overlap. I don't think that was entirely fair of him. I also don't think I handled it gracefully. I got prickly about it. I got distant. Because Dad's whole identity was wrapped up in that warehouse, being distant from the business somehow meant being distant from him too, like the two were the same relationship wearing different clothes. The real break happened 4 years ago at a birthday dinner for our mother, who'd passed a few years before that and whose birthday Dad still insisted on gathering for, which in hindsight was its own kind of unprocessed grief none of us were handling well. I made an offhand comment, half joking and half not, about how convenient it must be to get free labor out of your own son for 16 years. Dad didn't take it as a joke. He told me if I had opinions about how he ran his business or his family, I was welcome to keep them to myself. Mike backed him up instantly, the way he always did, and I left before the cake came out. My husband David drove home in silence beside me, and that was more or less the shape of things for 4 years: a Christmas card, a text on my birthday, nothing that could survive an actual phone call. So when Dad had his heart attack in February, I found out from my cousin, who found out from Mike's wife Amanda on Facebook, almost an hour after it happened. I drove to the hospital anyway, sat in a waiting room chair beside my brother for most of the night while he barely acknowledged I was there, and when Dad died 3 days later without ever really regaining consciousness, I stood at his bedside and felt something I still don't have a clean word for. Not quite grief, because I don't think I'd let myself stay close enough to him to grieve him cleanly. Something closer to a door slamming shut on a room I'd always assumed, somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd eventually get to walk back into. The funeral itself was fine, mostly. Dad had a lot of friends from the trade, a handful of longtime clients who showed up looking uncomfortable in suits they clearly didn't own many occasions to wear. Mike gave the eulogy. I wasn't asked to, which stung more than I expected, but I understood it. He'd been the son standing in that warehouse for 16 years and I hadn't. I told myself I'd made my peace with sitting in the second row instead of the first. It was afterward, at the reception at Mike and Amanda's house, that things went sideways. Mike and Amanda's house smelled like coffee and casserole dishes and the particular stale sweetness of flowers that had been sitting in a warm room too long. I was standing near the dessert table with a small plate I wasn't really eating from, making stiff small talk with my Aunt Barbara about nothing important: the weather, whether the caterer had done a decent job, anything that wasn't the actual reason we were all standing in a dead man's son's living room when Amanda came over. She'd always been kind to me, even through the years I was barely speaking to the rest of the family, and she had that careful, slightly too casual voice people use right before handing you something heavy. She asked whether I'd talked to the lawyer yet about the will. I told her no. Nobody had mentioned a lawyer to me at all, and I remember thinking in the half second before anything else happened that this was a strange thing to bring up at a reception, over a dessert table, with Dad's ashes still sitting in an urn on the mantel 20 feet away. Mike was standing about 6 feet off holding a beer at his own father's funeral reception, which even now strikes me as such a small, strange detail to fixate on, but I do, and he laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly. More like the laugh of a man confirming something he'd already decided was true a long time ago. He said, "Yeah, there's not really going to be a will meeting for you, Sarah. Dad redid everything about 2 years ago. The business, the property, all of it, it's mine. He didn't put you on anything." I remember setting my plate down very deliberately on the table, the way you do when your hands don't quite feel like your own hands anymore. I asked him if he was serious. He said of course he was serious. Why would he joke about something like that? And then he took another pull off the beer like we were discussing a football score instead of our father's entire estate. Then, and this is the part I've replayed more than any other single moment in this whole thing, he said, "Come on, Sarah, you checked out of this family a long time ago. What did you think was gonna happen?" A few people heard that. My uncle glanced over. Amanda's face did something complicated, somewhere between embarrassment and an apology she never quite said out loud. Aunt Barbara put a hand on my arm, the kind of touch meant to hold you in place before you say something you can't take back. I didn't say anything else. I found my husband, told him I needed to leave, and sat in the passenger seat of our car in complete silence the entire drive home, replaying that sentence on a loop I couldn't seem to shut off. I'm not going to pretend the following weeks were dignified. I spiraled in ways I'm not proud of. I looked up Ohio inheritance law more nights than I'll admit, sitting on the closed lid of the toilet at 2 in the morning so the phone light wouldn't wake David, scrolling through forum threads written by strangers whose situations almost matched mine but never quite did. I told myself it didn't matter, that I hadn't worked in that business, that I had no real claim to any of it, that this was simply Dad's final word on how he felt about me, and I was going to have to live with that word being nothing. I replayed that birthday dinner argument from 4 years earlier so many times I started doubting my own memory of who'd actually said what first. David let me be furious for about 2 weeks. Didn't try to fix it or talk me out of the anger, just kept dinner on the table most nights and let me disappear for long walks when I needed to be alone with my own head. But after those 2 weeks, he sat across from me at our kitchen table one evening and said something that stuck with me since. Sarah, being furious isn't going to tell you what actually happened. It's only going to tell you how you feel about not knowing. I hated that he was right. I told him so. He laughed gently and said that sounded about right for this family. So I did something about the not knowing instead of just sitting alone with it night after night. David's cousin's husband practices estate law, not in Ohio, but he agreed to look over what little I had, which at that point was essentially nothing. I didn't even own a copy of the will. What he told me reframed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. He said if your father redid his estate plan 2 years ago and specifically excluded you, that's entirely his right, full stop, nothing inherently wrong with that. But here's the thing, if he was recovering from a health event around that time, or under significant influence from someone who stood to benefit from the change, or if the redo cuts hard against decades of prior planning without any real paper trail explaining why, sometimes there's more worth looking at. I'm not telling you that's what happened here. I'm telling you not to assume you know the whole story just because your brother handed you the ending at a funeral reception. That sentence sat with me for a long time, because the truth was I genuinely didn't know what had happened 2 years earlier. I hadn't been talking to my father. I had no idea what his health had actually been like, who'd been around him managing things, what conversations had led up to whatever he'd eventually signed. All I had was my brother's version, delivered with a beer in his hand, wrapped inside a laugh I couldn't stop hearing at 3 in the morning. I started asking quiet questions. Not to Mike, I wasn't ready to go back to him yet, and honestly some part of me suspected that going to him first was the fastest way to make sure I never found out anything real. I called Aunt Barbara first, Dad's younger sister, the one who'd steadied my arm at the reception. I asked her gently if she knew anything about Dad redoing his will around 2 years earlier. She got quiet in a way that told me more than her words eventually did. She said Dad had been different for a stretch after a minor cardiac scare nobody had really told me about, because by that point nobody was telling me much of anything, and that around that same time, Mike had started handling more and more of Dad's day-to-day paperwork, bills, bank statements, eventually the business accounts entirely. She remembered Dad mentioning, almost in passing, getting the estate stuff squared away, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time because Dad was only 61 and it had sounded like ordinary responsible planning, the kind any parent his age might do. A cardiac scare I'd never been told about, Mike handling all his paperwork. 2 years later, a will that cut me out entirely from a business I'd never asked for a single piece of, delivered to me at a dessert table with a laugh attached, like the whole thing had been decided and settled long before I ever had a chance to weigh in. I still didn't have proof of anything, and I want to be honest that it would have been easy. In the version of this story I was tempted to tell myself at 2 in the morning, to leap straight from suspicion into certainty. I didn't have certainty. But I had was enough doubt to justify actually finding the paperwork instead of accepting my brother's word as the final answer. Dad's attorney, the one who'd apparently handled the estate, was a man named Mr. Bennett, out of a small firm about 20 minutes from where Dad had lived his whole life. I called his office directly, explained who I was, and asked whether I was entitled to see a copy of the will even though I hadn't been named a beneficiary in it. His paralegal explained that in Ohio, anyone named in a will or who would have been a beneficiary under a previous version, or who qualifies as an heir at law generally has a right to see it once it's been filed for probate. It hadn't been filed yet. Mike was dragging his feet on that particular step, which I found interesting in a way I tried hard not to read too much into before I had anything solid. I decided to wait. Not out of patience exactly, patience has never been my strongest trait, but because David's cousin's husband told me that whatever I decided to do, doing it before I actually had the document in hand was a fast way to burn whatever credibility I had left with the rest of the family. So I waited. I went back to work. I let my nieces distract me on the weekends and tried to remember there were parts of my life that had nothing to do with my father's estate. The will finally got filed for probate about 4 months after Dad died. I drove to the county courthouse myself on a weekday morning, took a number at the probate records window, and waited under fluorescent lighting beside a man filling out paperwork for a house he was clearly in the middle of losing. When the clerk finally called me up and handed over a thin manila folder, my hands weren't entirely steady taking it. I found an open seat at a long shared table and read through pages of legal language I barely understood, habendum clauses, persterps distributions, phrases that meant nothing to me and apparently everything to whoever had drafted them, until I found the section that actually mattered. A trust document referenced inside the will, dated 2 years and 4 months before Dad died. Signed, witnessed. Notarized with a raised seal I ran my thumb over without quite meaning to, as if I were checking it was real. On paper, it looked completely legitimate. but one line in that trust caught my attention because it didn't match the story Mike had told everyone at the funeral. The trust didn't say the business went entirely to Mike because I'd checked out of the family, the way Mike had framed it like some kind of moral ruling handed down from beyond the grave. It said the business and its associated real property were to pass to Mike in recognition of his ongoing operational role, with a separate provision, one Mike had never once mentioned to me, stating that if it could be established Dad had intended a more equal division of non-business assets between his two children, the trustee retained discretion to adjust distributions accordingly. There was also a life insurance policy, a fairly substantial one I'd genuinely never known existed, sitting entirely outside the will because life insurance passes by beneficiary designation rather than through a will at all. I called Mr. Bennett's office again, this time asking specifically about that policy. His paralegal transferred me to him directly once I explained who I was. He was careful the way lawyers tend to be, but he told me something that made my stomach drop in a completely different direction than the funeral had. He said the beneficiary designation on that policy had been updated at the exact same time as the trust, 2 years and 4 months earlier, and split 50-50 between Mike and me. My name had been on it the entire time. Ike either genuinely didn't know, which seemed unlikely given how closely he'd apparently been managing Dad's affairs by that point, or he did know and had simply never mentioned it, letting me stand at that funeral reception believing I'd been given nothing at all, that our father's final act toward me had been total erasure. I sat with that for several days before doing anything. There's a version of me that wanted to drive straight to Mike's house and drop that piece of paper in front of him. I didn't, partly because David talked me down gently over several long conversations, and partly because something in me, something maybe a little too much like our father, if I'm being fair to myself, wanted to handle it the way Dad would have respected, quietly, with the facts fully lined up first, not with a scene. So I called Mr. Bennett and asked him plainly what the formal next step would be to claim what was legally mine under that policy, and whether there was any mechanism for revisiting the discretionary provision regarding the non-business assets. He told me there was, that as a named beneficiary and an heir at law, I had every right to request a formal accounting, and that given the trust's own language, I could also petition for the trustee, which turned out to be his own firm acting in that capacity, to formally review whether Dad's broader intent had actually been honored. He said he'd need to schedule a meeting with all interested parties to walk through it properly. That meeting got scheduled for exactly 6 months after the funeral. I didn't tell Mike ahead of time what I'd found. I've asked myself more than once whether that was fair of me, but I kept remembering him standing there with his beer, laughing, telling everyone within earshot that I'd checked out and got precisely what I deserved, and some part of me, not the noblest part, I'll admit that freely, wanted him to hear the truth inside the same kind of room where he delivered his version, not with a beer in his hand this time, with a lawyer in the room instead. The meeting took place in Mr. Bennett's conference room, one of those spaces with a long table too big for the number of chairs around it, and a framed print of a lighthouse on the wall nobody was actually looking at. Mike showed up 8 minutes late, visibly irritated, checking his watch as he sat down, clearly assuming this was some routine formality he'd sign off on and be done with. Amanda came with him, sitting a little apart, closer to the door than I'd expected, her purse still on her shoulder like she hadn't decided how long she planned on staying. Aunt Barbara came too, at my request, sitting quietly beside me with her hands folded on the table, because I wanted at least one person in that room who remembered what getting the estate stuff squared away had actually sounded like from the outside, long before any of us understood it would matter this much. Mike looked at me when he sat down and said, not unkindly but not warmly either, "What's this about, Sarah?" Bennett said it was urgent. I didn't answer him directly. I let Mr. Bennett answer him instead, sliding the folder across the table and opening it to the first tabbed page like he'd rehearsed exactly where to start. He laid it out plainly and without any theatrics, which somehow made it land harder than drama ever could have. He confirmed the life insurance split 50-50, my name on it the entire time without my knowledge. He read the discretionary provision on the non-business assets aloud, slowly, so there was no room left for ambiguity about what it said. And then he said something I hadn't expected at all, something pulled from notes in Dad's own file, dated around the time the trust was created, a memo, in Dad's own recorded words as relayed to his attorney, stating that Mike was getting the business, because he built it alongside me, not because his sister doesn't matter, and that Dad had specifically wanted the life insurance and a portion of the property value preserved, so Sarah isn't left with nothing just because she chose a different path. I watched my brother's face while that memo was read aloud. He didn't laugh this time. Amanda looked at him like she was doing math she didn't like the answer to. I don't think Mike had lied to me out of malice, exactly. I've turned this over a lot since. I think he'd absorbed that entire business as his own so completely, and resented my absence so thoroughly that he'd genuinely convinced himself the whole estate belonged to him by right, and everything else was simply details he never felt obligated to bring up. That's not a defense. It's just I've come to believe what actually happened inside his head. The property adjustment took another 2 months to fully finalize, and I ended up with a settlement that wasn't life-changing but was real enough to pay down a significant chunk of our mortgage, and finally let David cut back his hours at the firm the way he'd wanted to for years. More than the money, though, was that memo, Dad's own words, recorded before he died, saying I mattered to him even inside the specific silence I'd let grow between us. I don't know if that undoes 4 years of not calling him. I don't think it's supposed to. Mike and I aren't close now, and I doubt we ever will be exactly the way we once were as kids. We're not enemies either. We had one real conversation a few weeks after everything settled, where he admitted he'd known about the insurance policy the whole time and simply hadn't thought it was his place to mention it before probate, which I don't fully believe but have chosen to let go of, because holding on to it wasn't going to give either of us our father back. We talk sometimes now, holidays mostly, occasionally a text about the nieces. It's not what it used to be. But it's honest, which it wasn't before, and I've decided that counts for something. What I keep coming back to, whenever someone asks me about all this, isn't the money and it isn't even really the memo, though both mattered more than I expected them to at the time. It's how close I came to letting one laugh at a funeral reception become the entire permanent story of what my father actually thought of me. I nearly let my brother's version, delivered in a moment of grief and old resentment, stand in as the whole truth simply because it was easier than doing the work of finding out for myself. I don't think that's really a lesson about wills or lawyers. I think it's a lesson about how much damage we let other people's version of events do to us, purely because we're too tired or too hurt or too used to losing to ever ask them to actually prove it. Before I hand things over to the next one, mine was about a will read 6 months too late. This next one's about a mother who thought she'd said her final word on her own son, and how much faster than 6 months it actually took for a bank manager to prove her wrong.